The chain rattled like old dog tags in Jack Morrow's weathered hands. 62 years of living, 24 of them in army green, and he'd never seen a Mustang's eyes hold such human grief. The Wyoming wind carried whispers through the abandoned barn's broken boards, speaking of things buried deeper than winter frost. Behind him, the Bighorn Mountains stood like silent sentinels, keeping watch over secrets that should have died with better men than him. Ghost, that's what he'd call the scarred stallion, pawed the earth as if trying to uncover what Jack had spent decades trying to forget. Before we begin this journey together, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what Jack discovers in that barn. The morning mist clung to Jack Morrow's boots, like memories he couldn't shake, each step through the tall grass behind his newly purchased Wyoming property, echoing with the phantom sound of marching cadence. 24 years in the army had taught him to read the land like scripture, and something about this forgotten corner of his 40 acres whispered of secrets buried beneath the surface. The Bighorn Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in clouds that reminded him of smoke from fires he'd rather not remember, while the October air carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that made his old soldier's instincts prickle like electricity before a storm. He'd bought this land to find peace, to let the silence heal wounds that Purple Hearts couldn't touch, but peace seemed as elusive as the morning fog that danced between the cottonwood trees. The trail he followed was barely visible, overgrown with prairie grass and wild sage, yet something drew him forward with the same inexorable pull that had once led him through jungles and deserts in service to flag and country. His weathered hands, scarred from shrapnel and marked by time, pushed aside the brittle branches that blocked his path, each snap and rustle a small prayer for whatever lay ahead. The abandoned barn materialized through the mist like a ghost ship emerging from fog, its weathered boards grey as old bones and sagging under the weight of decades and neglect. Jack's breath caught in his throat as his eyes fell upon the sight that would haunt his dreams for years to come. A magnificent Mustang, wild and proud, despite the heavy chain that bound him to a rusted post beside the barn's crumbling foundation. The horse's coat was the color of storm clouds, dappled with scars that spoke of battles fought and survived, while his eyes held a depth of intelligence and pain that reminded Jack of his own reflection in the mirror each morning. The chain was military-grade, the kind used to secure equipment in forward operating bases, and its presence here, in this forgotten corner of Wyoming, sent ice water through Jack's veins. Something about the way the Mustang stood, alert and watchful despite his captivity, reminded Jack of prisoners of war he'd known, men who'd maintained their dignity even when stripped of their freedom. The horse's mane flowed like silver in the morning light, and when their eyes met, Jack felt a recognition pass between them, soldier to soldier, survivor to survivor. This was no ordinary wild horse, and this was no ordinary abandonment. Jack approached slowly, his movements deliberate and respectful, the way he'd once approached wounded comrades in hostile territory. The Mustang, ghost, he found himself thinking, for the way the animal seemed to materialize from the mist, watched him with eyes that held no fear, only a weary acceptance that spoke of too much suffering and too little kindness. The chain was padlocked to a collar around the horse's neck, the metal worn smooth by constant movement, and Jack's trained eye immediately recognized the craftsmanship. This wasn't some rancher's makeshift restraint, but professional-grade equipment designed to hold without causing unnecessary harm. His fingers traced the links with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics, feeling the weight of each connection and wondering what kind of person would chain such a magnificent creature in this god-forsaken place. The lock was military issue, the kind he'd used countless times to secure sensitive equipment, and the sight of it here made his pulse quicken with a mixture of recognition and dread. Ghost stood perfectly still as Jack examined the restraints, as if understanding that this grizzled veteran might be his salvation. And in that moment of connection, Jack felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since his last day in uniform, The horse's breathing was steady and calm, but Jack could see the tension in every muscle, the coiled energy of a wild thing forced into captivity, waiting for the moment when freedom might once again be possible. The barn itself told a story of abandonment and decay, its roof partially collapsed and its walls bearing the scars of weather and time, yet something about its construction nagged at Jack's military-trained mind. The foundation was too solid, too precisely laid for a simple farm building, and the way it was positioned, with clear sightlines in all directions and natural cover from the surrounding trees, spoke of strategic thinking rather than agricultural necessity. Weeds grew through the gaps in the floorboards, and swallows had built their nests in the rafters, yet Jack noticed that the area immediately around the barn had been cleared recently, the grass cut short and the debris removed with military precision. His eyes swept the perimeter automatically, cataloguing potential threats and escape routes, old habits dying hard even in retirement, and he found himself moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that carelessness could be fatal. The barn's doors hung open like broken wings, revealing an interior shrouded in shadow and mystery, while the morning sun cast long fingers of light across the threshold like an invitation to step into the unknown. Ghost nickered softly, a sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the barn, and Jack felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as he realized that this place held secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The very air seemed charged with the weight of unfinished business, and Jack knew with the certainty of a man who'd spent his life reading danger that his peaceful retirement was about to become anything but peaceful. As Jack worked to free Ghost from his chains, using a bolt cutter he'd retrieved from his truck, he found himself speaking to the horse in the low, steady tones he'd once used to calm wounded soldiers in the field. The Mustang stood perfectly still during the process, as if understanding that this moment represented salvation, and when the chain finally fell away with a metallic crash that echoed across the empty landscape, Ghost didn't bolt as Jack had expected. Instead, the magnificent animal stepped closer, pressing his scarred muzzle against Jack's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude that brought unexpected tears to the veteran's eyes. The horse's breath was warm against his neck, and Jack felt a connection forming that transcended species. Two warriors recognizing each other across the divide of flesh and bone, united by the invisible bonds of suffering and survival. Ghost's coat was rough beneath Jack's weathered hands, marked by old wounds that had healed into white scars, each one a testament to battles fought and endured, and Jack found himself wondering what kind of hell this beautiful creature had survived. The Mustang's eyes held depths that reminded Jack of his own reflection after particularly difficult missions, the look of someone who'd seen too much and carried too many ghosts. And he realized that perhaps they'd found each other for reasons that went beyond mere chance. In that moment of connection, with the Wyoming wind singing through the grass and the mountains standing witness to their meeting, Jack felt something shift inside his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since hanging up his uniform for the last time. The sound of Ghost's hooves on the hard-packed earth was like a drumbeat calling Jack to action, and as he watched the Mustang explore his newfound freedom, circling the barn with cautious steps, the veteran felt the familiar stirring of mission consciousness that had defined his military career. This wasn't just about rescuing a chained horse. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies, too many signs that pointed to something larger and more dangerous than simple animal abandonment. The military-grade chain, the strategic positioning of the barn, the recent maintenance of the surrounding area, all of it spoke to Jack's trained mind of an operation that was either ongoing or recently concluded, and his instincts told him that Ghost was more than just a victim of circumstance. The horse moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to run free, yet there was something in his bearing that suggested training, discipline, a familiarity with human commands that went beyond the usual relationship between man and wild animal. Jack found himself studying Ghost's movements with the analytical eye of a soldier, noting the way the Mustang checked the perimeter before settling, the way his ears swiveled constantly to monitor for threats, the way he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with Jack while keeping escape routes open. This was no ordinary wild horse, and as the morning sun climbed higher in the Wyoming sky, Jack realized that freeing Ghost from his chains might have been the easy part. Understanding why he'd been chained in the first place was going to require him to dig into shadows he'd hoped never to revisit. Subscribe now, because what Jack discovers inside that barn will change everything he thought he knew about his past. The interior of the barn swallowed Jack's footsteps like a hungry grave, each board creaking beneath his weight with the protest of wood that had kept secrets too long. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the roof, creating a cathedral of light and shadow that reminded him of bombed-out churches in distant wars, while dust motes danced in the golden beams like the spirits of forgotten prayers. Ghost followed him to the threshold but refused to enter, standing sentinel outside with the wisdom of a creature who understood that some places held more than darkness. They held memories that could devour a man's soul. The smell hit Jack first, a mixture of old hay and something else, something metallic and familiar that made his stomach clench with recognition, the scent of gun oil and fear, of places where men had waited for orders that might never come. His eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, revealing details that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt floor, leading to a section of the barn where the floorboards looked newer than the rest, and scattered throughout the space. Items that had no business being in an abandoned farm building. Military-grade flashlights lay beside coils of communication wire, while a stack of MREs sat unopened in one corner, their packaging bearing dates from just 3 months ago. This wasn't abandonment, this was concealment, and Jack's trained mind began cataloguing the evidence with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent his career piecing together the truth from fragments of lies. The deeper Jack ventured into the barn's shadows, the more his unease grew, each discovery adding another piece to a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. A folding table sat against the far wall, its surface marked with the circular stains of coffee cups and the rectangular impressions of maps or documents, while a camp chair positioned nearby suggested long hours of planning or waiting. The walls themselves told stories in the form of nail holes and scuff marks, evidence of equipment that had been mounted and removed with military efficiency, leaving behind only the ghosts of their presence. Jack's fingers traced the marks with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins, feeling the weight of recent history in every scratch and dent, and he found himself wondering who had used this place and for what purpose. A generator sat in one corner, its fuel tank empty, but its presence suggesting that this location had been operational within recent memory, while extension cords snaked across the floor like the veins of some mechanical beast that had once brought light to these shadows. The very air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of conversations held in whispers, of plans made in darkness, of men who'd gathered here to discuss things that couldn't be spoken of in the light of day. Ghost's occasional whinny from outside served as a reminder that Jack wasn't alone in this investigation, that somewhere beyond these walls, a creature who'd suffered his own captivity waited for answers that might never come. Jack's exploration led him to a section of the barn where the floorboards were clearly newer than the rest, their edges sharp and unstained by decades of weather and neglect. Kneeling beside them, he could see that they'd been cut with precision and fitted with the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of military engineering, designed to conceal rather than simply repair. His fingers found the hidden latches almost by instinct, muscle memory from years of working with concealed equipment guiding his hands to the right spots, and when the section of floor lifted away, it revealed a sight that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Below lay a staircase descending into darkness, its steps carved from solid rock and lined with the kind of lighting fixtures he'd seen in classified facilities around the world. The air that rose from the depths carried the scent of electronics and recycled atmosphere, the distinctive smell of underground installations where men worked in artificial environments cut off from the natural world above. Jack's flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the darkness before being swallowed by shadows that seemed to have weight and substance, and he found himself standing at the threshold of a discovery that would either provide answers or destroy what remained of his peace. The staircase beckoned like a descent into hell, each step worn smooth by the passage of feet that had carried secrets up and down these hidden depths, and Jack realized that Ghost's chains had been the least of the mysteries waiting to be uncovered on his supposedly peaceful Wyoming property. The decision to descend came not from curiosity, but from duty. The same sense of obligation that had carried Jack through 24 years of military service and into situations where lesser men would have turned away. Each step down the hidden staircase felt like a journey backward through time, the temperature dropping with each foot of descent until the air carried the chill of underground spaces that never felt the warmth of sunlight. His flashlight beam revealed walls lined with the same precision stonework as the steps, while conduits for electrical cables ran along the ceiling like the nervous system of some buried creature waiting to be awakened. The staircase ended at a heavy steel door, its surface unmarked but bearing the unmistakable signs of recent use, fresh scratches around the lock, oil stains on the hinges, and the kind of wear patterns that spoke of regular opening and closing. Jack's hand hesitated on the handle, knowing that whatever lay beyond this threshold would change everything, that the peaceful retirement he'd sought in Wyoming was about to be shattered by truths he'd hoped were buried forever. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant echo of Ghost's movements above, and in that moment of stillness, Jack felt the weight of every decision that had led him to this place. The door opened with surprising ease, revealing a corridor that stretched beyond the reach of his flashlight, lined with doors that suggested a facility far larger than the barn above could possibly conceal. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a base of operations, and Jack's military mind immediately began calculating the resources and planning that would have been required to construct such a facility without detection. The underground corridor stretched before Jack like a throat waiting to swallow him whole, its walls lined with the kind of institutional fixtures that spoke of government funding and classified purposes. Emergency lighting strips ran along the baseboards, their red glow providing just enough illumination to reveal the scope of what lay hidden beneath his property, while ventilation grates whispered with the movement of air that suggested a complex life support system still functioning after all these years. Each door he passed bore only numbers, no names or descriptions to hint at their purpose, but the wear patterns on the handles and the scuff marks on the floors told stories of regular use by people who'd moved through these spaces with the efficiency of long familiarity. Jack's flashlight revealed details that made his blood run cold. Fresh coffee stains on the floor, cigarette butts in a makeshift ashtray, and the lingering scent of human occupation that suggested this facility had been active within recent weeks, if not days. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets, and Jack found himself moving with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that he was trespassing in a place where his presence might be considered an act of treason. Ghost's distant whinny echoed down the stairwell like a call from another world, reminding Jack that above ground, in the honest light of day, a creature who'd suffered his own imprisonment waited for the truth to set them both free. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking Jack deeper into a labyrinth of questions that he wasn't sure he was prepared to answer. Yet the same sense of duty that had defined his military career drove him forward into the darkness. As Jack reached the end of the corridor, his flashlight beam fell upon a sight that made his knees weak with recognition and terror. a command center that looked like it had been abandoned only hours ago. Its banks of monitors dark, but still warm to the touch. Its communication equipment bearing the familiar logos of agencies he'd hoped never to encounter again. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with symbols and coordinates that spoke of operations spanning continents, while filing cabinets stood open as if someone had left in a hurry, taking only the most critical documents and leaving behind evidence of activities that should have ended with the Cold War. The air tasted of ozone and fear, of decisions made in darkness and consequences that rippled through decades. And Jack realized with growing horror that his peaceful Wyoming property sat atop a facility that had been operational far longer than any official records would ever admit. A calendar on one wall showed the current month, with dates marked in red ink that suggested a timeline of activities extending into the future, while a coffee cup on the central desk still held the dregs of a beverage consumed within the last day or two. This wasn't a relic of past operations. This was an active facility, and Jack's presence here had just made him either a witness or a target, depending on who discovered his intrusion first. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed down on him like the tons of earth and rock above, and he understood with crystalline clarity that freeing Ghost from his chains had been more than an act of kindness. It had been the first step in unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power and stretched back through decades of classified history. The truth Ghost was guarding runs deeper than Jack ever imagined. Subscribe to discover what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. Jack's hands trembled as he rifled through the scattered documents on the command center desk, each page revealing fragments of a truth so devastating that his mind struggled to process the implications. Operation Ghost Wind. The name leapt from the papers like a curse from his past, bringing with it memories of missions that officially never happened and men who died for secrets that were supposed to have been buried with them. The files spoke of psychological warfare programs, of experiments in animal-human communication bonds, of projects that pushed the boundaries of military ethics so far that they'd been classified beyond the reach of congressional oversight. Ghost, the Mustang he'd freed from chains above, wasn't just a wild horse caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a survivor of experiments that had cost the lives of dozens of animals and the sanity of the soldiers who'd worked with them. Jack's vision blurred as he read accounts of horses trained to carry messages through hostile territory, their minds linked to human handlers through methods that violated every principle of humane treatment. And he realized that the scars on Ghost's body weren't from battles with other animals. They were from electrodes and surgical procedures designed to turn a wild creature into a living weapon. The coffee cup on the desk seemed to mock him with its warmth, evidence that whoever had been running this operation was still active, still pursuing goals that should have been abandoned when the Berlin Wall fell and the world moved beyond the desperate measures of the Cold War. Each document he examined added another layer to a conspiracy that reached into the present day, and Jack understood with growing dread that his discovery of this facility had made him a liability that someone would soon move to eliminate. The deeper Jack delved into the files, the more his horror grew, each revelation painting a picture of an organization that had operated in the shadows for decades, answerable to no one and constrained by no moral boundaries. Photographs showed horses in laboratory settings, their eyes reflecting the same pain and intelligence he'd seen in Ghost's gaze, while technical diagrams detailed procedures that made Jack's stomach churn with revulsion and rage. The animals had been subjected to neural implants, chemical conditioning, and psychological manipulation designed to create perfect military assets, creatures that could carry out missions in hostile territory while maintaining the appearance of wild animals beyond. Suspicion. Ghost's survival was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to the strength of spirit that had allowed him to endure years of torture while maintaining his essential wildness. and Jack felt a surge of protective fury that reminded him of his feelings toward the young soldiers he'd led into combat. The files revealed that the program had been shut down officially in 1987, but the evidence around him suggested that it had simply gone deeper underground, funded by black budgets and operated by men who believed that the ends justified any means necessary to achieve them. A personnel roster showed names that Jack recognized from his own military career, officers who'd disappeared into classified assignments and never been heard from again, their fates now revealed as something far worse than death in combat. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him like a physical force, the realization that his own government had been capable of such monstrous acts, making him question everything he'd believed about duty, honor, and the righteousness of the cause he'd served for 24 years. Among the scattered papers, Jack found a mission briefing dated just 3 weeks ago, its contents making his blood freeze in his veins as he realized that Operation Ghostwind wasn't just continuing, it was expanding. The document outlined plans for a new phase of the program, one that would move beyond animal subjects to human volunteers, soldiers who would undergo the same neural conditioning that had been perfected on creatures like Ghost. The language was clinical, sterile, describing human beings as assets and platforms for advanced psychological warfare techniques, while casualty projections were discussed with the same detachment that might be applied to equipment losses in a training exercise. Jack's hands shook as he read about recruitment protocols targeting veterans with PTSD, men and women whose psychological vulnerabilities would make them ideal candidates for experimental procedures that promised to eliminate trauma while creating perfect soldiers incapable of questioning orders. The irony wasn't lost on him. He himself fit the profile perfectly. A damaged veteran seeking peace in isolation, vulnerable to approaches from handlers who would promise healing while delivering enslavement. Ghost's chains suddenly took on new meaning, not just as physical restraints, but as symbols of the invisible bonds that the program sought to place on human minds, turning free will into a luxury that only the unbroken could afford. The mission briefing included a timeline that extended into the next year, with phases of implementation that would begin with voluntary subjects and gradually expand to include entire military units, creating an army of psychologically conditioned soldiers who would follow orders without question or conscience. Jack's exploration of the command center revealed equipment that belonged in science fiction rather than reality. Banks of computers running programs with names like Neural Mapping Protocol and Behavioral Modification Suite, their screens displaying data streams that tracked everything from brainwave patterns to stress hormone levels. A medical bay adjoining the main room contained surgical equipment that made Jack's skin crawl, instruments designed for procedures that blurred the line between healing and torture, while restraint systems built into the examination tables spoke of subjects who hadn't volunteered for whatever had been done to them. The walls were lined with monitors that could display feeds from cameras positioned throughout the facility and beyond, creating a surveillance network that extended far beyond the boundaries of Jack's property and into the surrounding countryside. He realized with growing alarm that his every movement since arriving in Wyoming had likely been observed and recorded, that his purchase of the property might not have been the random act of a retiring veteran seeking peace, but part of a larger plan to draw him into the web of Operation Ghostwind. The facility's communication equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of reaching anywhere in the world through encrypted channels that bypassed normal military and intelligence networks, while a weapons locker contained firearms and ammunition that suggested the operators were prepared to defend their secrets with lethal force. Ghost's presence above ground suddenly seemed less like coincidence and more like bait, a lure designed to draw Jack into the depths where he could be evaluated, recruited, or eliminated, depending on his usefulness to the program's goals. The sound of vehicles approaching from above shattered the underground silence like gunshots, their engines growing louder as they navigated the rough terrain toward the barn, and Jack realized with crystalline clarity that his time for investigation had run out. The monitors around him flickered to life as motion sensors detected the approaching convoy, displaying images of black SUVs and military vehicles that moved with the precision of a well-coordinated operation, while radio chatter filled the air with coded communications that spoke of containment protocols and asset recovery. Jack's military training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating escape routes and defensive positions while his hands gathered the most damning documents from the desk, stuffing them into his jacket with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that the evidence he carried might be the only thing standing between the world and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. The facility's automated systems began activating around him, lights coming on throughout the complex as security protocols engaged, and he realized that his presence had triggered alarms that would bring the full weight of Operation Ghostwind down upon him within minutes. Ghost's terrified whinnying echoed down the stairwell, the sound of a creature who recognized the approach of his tormentors, and Jack felt a surge of protective rage that overrode his fear and sent him racing toward the stairs with the desperate speed of a man who had found something worth dying for. The underground facility that had seemed like a tomb moments before now felt like a trap closing around him, its walls pressing in with the weight of secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. And Jack understood that his peaceful retirement had just become a war for survival against an enemy that wore the uniform of his own country. As Jack reached the bottom of the staircase, the sound of boots on the barn floor above told him that the facility's operators had arrived and were already moving to secure the area, their voices carrying the calm professionalism of men who had done this many times before. The documents in his jacket felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, each page a potential death sentence for anyone who possessed knowledge of Operation Ghostwind's true scope and purpose. While the evidence he'd gathered painted a picture of corruption and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. Ghost's cries from outside grew more frantic, the sound of a creature who had endured too much suffering to face capture again, and Jack felt his heart breaking as he realized that saving the Mustang might require sacrificing his own life to ensure that the truth about the program reached the outside world. The staircase stretched above him like a ladder to hell, each step taking him closer to a confrontation with men who had abandoned every principle of honor and duty in pursuit of power that corrupted everything it touched, while the weight of his own military oath pressed down on him like a physical force. He had sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and the evidence in his possession proved that the greatest threat to American freedom came not from foreign powers, but from the shadows within his own government, from men who had perverted the very ideals they claimed to serve. The sound of Ghost's hooves on hard ground told him that the Mustang was still free, still fighting against the chains that others sought to place upon him, and Jack drew strength from that knowledge as he prepared to climb toward a battle that would determine whether truth or conspiracy would triumph in the darkness above. Jack's race against time has just begun. Subscribe now to see if he can expose the truth before Operation Ghostwind silences him forever. Jack's ascent up the hidden staircase felt like climbing toward his own execution, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation with forces that had operated in darkness for decades, their power growing like cancer in the shadows of American democracy. The voices above had multiplied, suggesting a team of operatives who moved with the efficiency of men accustomed to cleaning up loose ends and eliminating witnesses, while the sound of equipment being deployed told him that they'd come prepared for every contingency except the possibility that their secrets might already be beyond their reach. Ghost's terrified whinnying had given way to an ominous silence that made Jack's blood run cold, and he feared that the magnificent Mustang, who had survived years of torture, might have finally fallen victim to the very people who had created him as a weapon of war. The documents pressed against his chest like a shield made of paper and ink, their weight insignificant compared to the truth they contained, evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government and stretched back through decades of classified operations that had sacrificed honor on the altar of expedience. His military training warred with his conscience as he approached the barn floor, knowing that the men above wore the same uniform he had served with pride, yet understanding that they had perverted everything that uniform represented in pursuit of goals that violated every principle of human decency. The hidden entrance to the facility gaped below him like the mouth of hell, its darkness holding secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect, while above him waited a reckoning that would determine whether truth or conspiracy would triumph in the Wyoming wilderness. The barn floor creaked beneath Jack's boots as he emerged from the hidden staircase, his eyes adjusting to the afternoon light that streamed through gaps in the weathered walls, revealing a scene that made his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 3 men in tactical gear stood near the barn's entrance, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed, their faces hidden behind masks that spoke of operations conducted beyond the reach of oversight or accountability. Ghost stood in the center of the barn, his magnificent form trembling with rage and terror, while a 4th operative held a tranquilizer gun aimed at the Mustang's neck, the weapon's presence confirming Jack's worst fears about the fate that awaited both horse and man. The lead operative turned as Jack appeared, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man accustomed to command. Yet there was something in his bearing that spoke of corruption and moral compromise, the subtle signs that Jack had learned to recognize in officers who had sold their souls for advancement and power. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn's broken roof, creating a cathedral of light and shadow that seemed to mock the sacred nature of the confrontation taking place within its walls, while the Wyoming wind whispered through the gaps in the boards, like the voices of all the men and animals who had died to keep Operation Ghostwind's secrets buried. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon he no longer carried, muscle memory from decades of military service reminding him that he was outgunned and outnumbered. Yet the fire in his chest burned brighter than his fear as he prepared to make his final stand for truth and justice. The lead operative's voice cut through the barn's silence like a blade through silk, his words carrying the weight of authority backed by unlimited resources and the willingness to use lethal force to protect secrets that had already cost too many lives. He spoke of national security and classified operations, of the need for men like Jack to understand that some truths were too dangerous for public consumption, while his companions maintained their positions with the practiced ease of soldiers who had conducted similar operations countless times before. Ghost's eyes never left Jack's face, the Mustang's gaze holding a depth of understanding that transcended species, as if the magnificent creature recognized that this moment would determine the fate of all who had suffered under Operation Ghostwind's twisted banner. The operative's words washed over Jack like poison, each syllable designed to justify the unjustifiable, to make him complicit in crimes that violated every principle he had sworn to uphold during his military career. Yet the documents pressed against his chest reminded him that he carried evidence of atrocities that the world deserved to know. The barn itself seemed to hold its breath as the confrontation unfolded, its weathered walls bearing witness to a moment that would either see justice triumph or truth buried forever beneath the weight of institutional power and corruption. Jack's response came not from his mind, but from his heart, the words flowing from a place deeper than fear or calculation, carrying the weight of every oath he had ever taken and every principle he had ever held sacred. Jack's declaration of defiance rang through the barn like a battle cry, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 24 years serving his country with honor and would not be intimidated by those who had perverted that service for their own ends. The documents in his jacket represented more than evidence. They were a sacred trust, a responsibility to all who had suffered and died under Operation Ghostwind's banner, and he would not allow them to be buried again in the darkness of classified files and official denials. Ghost seemed to sense the shift in the barn's atmosphere, the Mustang's posture straightening as if drawing strength from Jack's courage, while the operative's body language revealed their surprise at encountering resistance from someone they had expected to intimidate into compliance. The lead operative's mask couldn't hide the calculation in his eyes, as he weighed the costs of eliminating a decorated veteran against the risks of allowing him to live with knowledge that could destroy careers and topple governments, while his companions shifted nervously as they realized that their mission had just become infinitely more complicated. The afternoon light streaming through the barn's roof seemed to intensify, as if the very heavens were bearing witness to the confrontation between truth and corruption, between the ideals that America claimed to represent and the reality of what it had become in the shadows, where men like these operated without oversight or conscience. Jack's military training told him that he was outgunned and outnumbered, yet his heart reminded him that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds, that some truths were worth dying for, even when victory seemed impossible. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, each second bringing the confrontation closer to a resolution that would be written in blood and measured in the cost of principles abandoned or upheld. Ghost's breathing was the only sound in the barn's charged atmosphere, the Mustang's presence serving as a living reminder of all who had suffered under Operation Ghostwind's experiments, while the operatives' weapons remained trained on targets they had been ordered to eliminate without question or conscience. Jack's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies, his military experience calculating angles and distances, while his heart prepared for the sacrifice that might be necessary to ensure that the truth reached the outside world, that the evidence in his possession would not die with him in this forgotten corner of Wyoming. The lead operative's finger tightened on his weapon's trigger, the minute movement speaking of a decision made and a line crossed, while Jack's own hand moved toward the documents that represented his final act of service to the country he had sworn to defend. The barn's walls seemed to close in around them, the weight of decades of secrets pressing down like the tons of earth above the hidden facility, while outside the Wyoming wind carried the scent of approaching storm clouds that would soon wash the blood from the ground and leave only silence to mark the place where truth and corruption had finally met in open battle. Ghost's eyes reflected the afternoon light, like mirrors of the soul, the Mustang's gaze holding all the pain and hope of creatures who had suffered in darkness while dreaming of freedom. And Jack drew strength from that reflection as he prepared to make his choice between survival and honor. The explosion of movement that followed seemed to unfold in slow motion, each participant in the deadly ballet moving with the precision of training and the desperation of men who understood that only one side would walk away from this confrontation. Jack's dive toward Ghost was motivated not by strategy, but by instinct, the same protective impulse that had driven him to shield wounded comrades in distant wars, while the operative's response revealed the cold efficiency of men who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation or remorse. The barn erupted in chaos as weapons fired and bodies moved, the sound of gunshots echoing off the weathered walls like thunder from a storm that had been building for decades, while Ghost's terrified scream cut through the noise like a blade through the heart of anyone who still possessed a soul. Jack felt the documents scatter from his jacket as he rolled across the barn floor, their pages fluttering like white doves seeking freedom from the violence that surrounded them, and he realized with crystalline clarity that his mission had changed from escape to ensuring that at least some of the evidence survived to tell the story of Operation Ghostwind's crimes. The afternoon light streaming through the barn's roof was stained red with blood and sacrifice, while the Wyoming wind carried the scent of gunpowder and death across the landscape that had once promised peace but had delivered only war. Ghost's hooves thundered against the barn floor as the Mustang reared in terror and rage, his magnificent form silhouetted against the light like a symbol of all that was wild and free, in a world increasingly dominated by those who sought to chain and control everything they touched. The battle for truth has begun in blood and fire. Subscribe to discover whether Jack and Ghost can escape the shadows that have haunted them both. The helicopter's rotors had faded into the distance like a dying heartbeat, but Jack knew they would return with reinforcements before dawn broke over the Bighorn Peaks. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the underground chamber, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders like the earth above. Ghost stood beside him in the narrow corridor, the stallions breathing steady and calm despite the chaos that had erupted around them. The horse seemed to understand that they were no longer just running from chains. They were running from ghosts that wore the uniforms of living men. Jack's fingers traced the dog tags hanging around his neck, feeling the worn metal that had survived firefights in places the government claimed never existed. The silence between them was not empty, but full of shared understanding. Two warriors who had been abandoned by the very system they had served with unwavering loyalty. The emergency lighting cast long shadows down the concrete hallway, revealing doors that Jack remembered from briefings he was supposed to have forgotten. Each door bore a number and a classification level that made his blood run cold, reminders of operations that had cost good men their lives and their sanity. He moved forward with Ghost, following close behind, the stallion's hooves echoing softly against the polished floor that had once been walked by generals and politicians who played games with soldiers' lives. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and old secrets, the kind of atmosphere that clung to places where truth went to die. Jack's hand instinctively moved to the Colt, .45 holstered at his hip, a weapon that had saved his life more times than he could count in jungles and deserts where honor was measured in blood spilled for brothers who would never come home. The weight of it was comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant even when the world shifted beneath your feet like quicksand. Behind them, the sound of boots on metal stairs echoed through the facility, growing closer with each passing second. Jack counted at least 6 men, maybe 8, moving with the precision of a tactical team that had done this before. They were hunting him like he was some kind of terrorist, when all he had done was free a chained horse and stumble into a truth that powerful men wanted to keep buried. The irony was not lost on him. A man who had spent 30 years defending his country was now being hunted by that same country for asking the wrong questions. Ghost's ears flicked back toward the approaching sounds. But the stallion showed no fear, only the alert readiness of a creature that had learned to survive in a world that offered no mercy to the weak or the naive. Jack felt a surge of pride for this magnificent animal that had chosen to trust him, to follow him into danger when every instinct should have told the horse to run as far and as fast as possible. The corridor branched ahead, offering 3 possible routes deeper into the facility. Jack's military training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating angles of approach, defensive positions, and escape routes with the cold efficiency that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam and countless classified missions afterward. He chose the left passage, knowing it would lead them toward the vehicle bay, where they might find transportation out of this underground tomb. Ghost moved beside him like a shadow, the stallion's presence both comforting and surreal in this sterile environment, designed for machines and men who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The walls were lined with photographs of military operations, faces of soldiers who had died for causes they were never allowed to understand fully. Jack recognized some of those faces, remembered sharing cigarettes and stories with men who had believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves, only to discover they were pawns in games played by people who would never risk their own blood. A door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" stood slightly ajar ahead of them, spilling yellow light into the corridor like a beacon of false hope. Jack approached it carefully, his weapon drawn and ready, knowing that behind every door in this place lay either salvation or damnation. Ghost pressed close to his shoulder, the stallion's warmth a reminder that not everything in this cold world was designed to deceive and destroy. Through the crack in the door, Jack could see banks of computer monitors displaying satellite feeds, communication intercepts, and surveillance footage from locations around the globe. The scope of the operation was staggering, a web of intelligence gathering and covert action that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined during his years of service. On one screen, he recognized the barn where he had first found Ghost, the image captured from an overhead drone that had been watching them from the very beginning. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had been observed, studied, manipulated from the moment he had cut those chains and set the Mustang free. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the crackle of radio communications and the metallic click of weapons being readied for action. Jack knew they had perhaps minutes before the tactical team reached their position, and the narrow corridor offered little in the way of defensive advantages. He looked into Ghost's dark eyes and saw his own determination reflected there, the shared resolve of two beings who had been pushed too far by forces beyond their control. The stallion's scars told a story of survival against impossible odds, and Jack felt a kinship with this creature that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. They were both veterans of wars they had never chosen to fight, marked by experiences that had shaped them into something harder and more resilient than those who had never faced the darkness that lived in the hearts of men. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, knowing that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, and that freedom was a prize worth any sacrifice. The truth they've uncovered could destroy everything. Subscribe to witness the final confrontation between honor and betrayal. The dawn came blood-red over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the sky the color of old wounds that never properly healed. Jack crouched behind the fallen oak, his rifle steady against the bark, watching the black helicopters circle like vultures over carrion. Ghost stood beside him, nostrils flaring, reading the wind for the scent of approaching death. The Mustang's eyes held the same fire that had burned in Jack's squad when they'd walked into that Afghan valley 30 years ago, knowing they might not walk out. The forest around them pulsed with the rhythm of war, every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a harbinger of violence. Jack's finger traced the trigger guard, muscle memory from 1,000 firefights flooding back like a river breaking through a dam. The first team moved through the trees with military precision, their black tactical gear making them look like death itself walking upright. Jack counted 8 men, all carrying weapons he recognized from his classified days, weapons that weren't supposed to exist outside of government black sites. Their leader wore the same cold expression Jack had seen on Colonel Morrison's face the day they'd buried the truth about Operation Nightfall. These weren't just mercenaries, they were ghosts from his past, sent to silence the last witness to crimes that reached into the highest levels of government. Ghost's ears flicked forward, and Jack knew the Mustang could sense the evil radiating from these men like heat from a forge. The horse had survived captivity and torture. Now he would help Jack survive this final battle. Jack's first shot dropped the point man before the team knew they were under attack, the crack of his rifle echoing through the forest like thunder from heaven itself. Ghost reared and struck out with his hooves, catching the second man in the chest and sending him flying backward into a tree with the sound of breaking bones. The remaining 6 scattered for cover, their discipline evident in how quickly they adapted to the ambush. But Jack had the advantage of knowing this land, like the lines on his weathered hands. He moved through the trees like a spectre, using every lesson the army had taught him about survival and warfare. Ghost followed, his hooves silent on the forest floor, his presence a reminder that some bonds transcend species and circumstance. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts, a warrior and his guardian, fighting for truth in a world built on lies. The firefight lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like 20 hours to Jack, each second stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. He used the terrain to his advantage, drawing the mercenaries deeper into the forest, where their superior numbers meant nothing against his knowledge of every rock and ravine. Ghost appeared and disappeared like smoke, striking when least expected, his wild instincts perfectly complementing Jack's military training. 2 more men fell to Jack's rifle, their bodies crumpling among the pine needles like discarded puppets. The survivors began to retreat, their confidence shattered by the realization that they were hunting a man who had been forged in the fires of real war. Jack let them go, knowing that sometimes mercy was the cruelest weapon of all. As the sound of helicopters faded into the distance, Jack stood among the bodies of men who had come to kill him for knowing too much. Ghost nuzzled his shoulder, the Mustang's breath warm against his neck, a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was still something worth protecting. The files from the underground chamber lay scattered around them, pages of evidence that would expose decades of government corruption and betrayal. Jack gathered them carefully, knowing that these documents were more than paper and ink. They were the voices of dead soldiers crying out for justice. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning, and Jack Morrow had chosen his side. The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the pines, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. Jack mounted Ghost bareback, feeling the Mustang's powerful muscles bunch beneath him as they prepared to ride toward an uncertain future. Behind them lay the graves of men who had sold their souls for money and power. Ahead lay the long road to redemption and truth. Ghost's hooves struck the earth with the rhythm of a war drum, each step carrying them further from the shadows of the past and closer to a reckoning that had been 30 years in the making. The battle for America's conscience has begun. Subscribe to witness the final confrontation between justice and corruption. 3 days later, Jack sat in the office of Senator Patricia Hawkins, the files from Operation Nightfall spread across her mahogany desk, like accusations written in blood. The senator's face had gone pale as she read the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she turned each page that detailed decades of illegal weapon sales and assassinations. Ghost waited outside in the parking garage, hidden in the shadows between concrete pillars, his presence a constant reminder that some truths were worth dying for. Jack watched the senator's expression change from skepticism to horror to grim determination, knowing that she was one of the few politicians in Washington who still remembered what honor meant. The weight of 30 years pressed down on the room like a physical force, demanding acknowledgement and justice. Senator Hawkins looked up from the files, her eyes reflecting the same haunted expression Jack had seen in the mirror every morning since Afghanistan. She understood the magnitude of what he was asking, to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, to risk everything for the sake of dead soldiers who could no longer speak for themselves. The documents proved that Operation Nightfall had been a cover for illegal arms deals, that American weapons had been sold to enemies who used them to kill American troops. Jack's squad had discovered the truth, and they had been silenced for it, all except him, the sole survivor who had carried the burden of their sacrifice for 3 decades. Ghost's presence outside was a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely allies emerged from the darkest circumstances. The senator's phone rang, and Jack knew from her expression that their time was running out. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that powerful men would kill to keep their secrets buried. When she hung up, she looked at Jack with the same respect he had once reserved for fallen comrades. Recognizing in him a warrior who had never stopped fighting for his brothers, the files would be copied and distributed to journalists and investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated, ensuring that the truth would survive even if they didn't. Jack felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the burden of silence finally shared with someone who had the power to act. Outside, Ghost sensed the change in the air, his ears pricking forward as black SUVs began to circle the building like sharks, scenting blood in the water. Jack emerged from the senator's office knowing that he had lit a fuse that couldn't be extinguished, that the explosion of truth would either cleanse the corruption or destroy him in the process. He mounted Ghost in the parking garage, feeling the Mustang's muscles coil with anticipation as they prepared for what might be their final ride. The horse had been chained and tortured, but he had never been broken. Now he would help Jack ensure that the same could be said of American justice. Together, they rode out into the Washington night, two survivors carrying the hopes of the dead. The chase began immediately, black vehicles pouring out of hidden positions like ants from a disturbed nest. Ghost's hooves struck sparks from the asphalt as they galloped through the empty streets, his wild heritage giving him speed and endurance that no domesticated horse could match. Jack leaned low over the Mustang's neck, feeling the rhythm of their shared heartbeat as bullets whined past them in the darkness. They were heading for the Lincoln Memorial, where Jack planned to make his final stand among the monuments to America's greatest heroes. If he was going to die, it would be in a place that remembered what the country was supposed to stand for, surrounded by the spirits of men who had died for principles rather than profit. Ghost's breath came in great clouds of steam as they reached the memorial steps, his sides heaving, but his spirit unbroken. Jack dismounted and pressed his face against the Mustang's neck, feeling the warmth and strength that had carried him through the darkest hours of his life. The black SUVs were closing in, their occupants preparing for a final assault that would silence the last witness to Operation Nightfall. But Jack was no longer afraid. He had done what his fallen comrades had died trying to do, and their sacrifice would finally have meaning. Ghost nuzzled his shoulder one last time, a gesture of loyalty that transcended species and circumstance before disappearing into the shadows to await whatever came next. The final battle for truth begins at dawn. Subscribe to discover whether justice will triumph over corruption in the shadow of Lincoln's legacy. The sun rose over the Lincoln Memorial like a benediction, its golden light washing across the marble steps where Jack Morrow knelt with his rifle across his knees. The black SUVs had formed a perimeter around the monument, their occupants waiting for orders that would never come because Senator Hawkins had worked through the night to ensure the truth reached every major news outlet in America. Jack's phone buzzed with notifications, headlines screaming about Operation Nightfall, about decades of corruption and betrayal, about the soldiers who had died to protect secrets that should have been exposed long ago. Ghost emerged from the shadows between the columns, his coat gleaming in the morning light, no longer a chained prisoner, but a symbol of freedom reclaimed. The Mustang's eyes held the same peace that Jack felt, settling over his own soul, the peace that came from finally laying down a burden too heavy for one man to carry. The lead agent approached, with his hands raised, his weapon holstered, defeat written across his face like a confession. The files had been released, the story was breaking across every network, and there was no point in silencing Jack now that the truth had already escaped into the light. Jack stood slowly, feeling his age in every joint and muscle, but also feeling lighter than he had in 30 years. The agent spoke quietly, professionally, explaining that there would be investigations and hearings, that some people would go to prison while others would simply disappear into the shadows they had always inhabited. Ghost stepped closer, his presence a reminder that some victories were measured not in blood spilled, but in chains broken and truths revealed. Senator Hawkins arrived as the federal agents were withdrawing, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent the night fighting a war with telephones and computers instead of rifles and grenades. She approached Jack with the respect due a soldier who had completed an impossible mission, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of grief and pride that he had seen in the faces of Gold Star mothers. The investigation would take years, she explained, but the foundation had been laid for justice, for accountability, for ensuring that the sacrifice of Jack's squad would never be forgotten or repeated. Ghost allowed her to touch his neck, a gesture of acceptance that spoke to the Mustang's ability to recognize allies in the fight for what was right. The media arrived like a flood, cameras and microphones thrust forward to capture the face of the man who had brought down a conspiracy decades in the making. Jack spoke simply and directly, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent in service to his country and his fallen brothers. He told the story of Operation Nightfall, of soldiers who had died for discovering the truth, of a government that had chosen profit over principle and power over justice. Ghost stood beside him throughout the interview, the Mustang's presence a living symbol of survival and redemption, proof that even the most broken spirits could find healing and purpose. The questions came like artillery fire, but Jack answered each one with the precision of a man who had nothing left to hide. As the day wore on, Jack felt the ghosts of his fallen comrades finally beginning to rest, their voices no longer crying out for justice, but whispering words of gratitude and peace. Ghost nuzzled his shoulder, the Mustang's breath warm against his neck, a reminder that their bond had been forged in shared suffering and tempered by mutual salvation. The investigation would continue, the guilty would face judgment, and the dead would finally receive the honor they deserved. Jack mounted Ghost one last time, feeling the Mustang's powerful muscles bunch beneath him as they prepared to ride away from the monuments and memorials toward a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met beside that abandoned barn. The crowd parted as they rode through the streets of Washington, Ghost's hooves ringing against the pavement like a bell tolling for justice finally served. Jack felt the weight of 30 years lifting from his shoulders with each step, replaced by something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. They were heading home to Wyoming, to the land where their story had begun, where an old soldier and a wild Mustang had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together. Behind them, the machinery of justice was beginning to turn, grinding slowly but inexorably toward accountability and truth. Ghost's ears pricked forward as they left the city behind, his instincts already reaching toward the mountains and forests where they both belonged, where freedom meant more than just the absence of chains. Their journey toward redemption is complete, but the legacy of their courage will echo through generations. Subscribe to discover how one man and one horse changed the course of American history.